I would like to preface that this information is created for the general public and not written as a scholarly thesis, and thus occasionally uses absolutist terms along with vague generalizations. The most predominant generalization being the term Germanic. I do not intend to speak of blonde-haired yodelers clad in lederhosen that are fond of eating bratwurst. Rather, I am referring to confederate tribes of martial peoples that lived in a vast diaspora, stretching to the east in the Balkans, to the north in Scandinavia, to the south towards Italy, and to the west in England. Thus, with such a diverse range of people, there will certainly be many regional differences, not only in language, but also in religion. For example, Odin has different names in many religions in the Germanic diaspora. The Norse referred to him as Othin, the Saxons as Woden, and the Bavarians as Wotan. It is likely that the differences in their religious practices are not limited to the names of their deities, but also to an extent differ in their understanding of cosmology and morality. The majority of our knowledge on the Germanic religions were recorded in Iceland about a millennia ago by ethnic Norse, hence the reason these gods are often referred to as Nordic, despite the fact that they are worshipped across the Germanic diaspora. Thus, it is possible that there are differences between the cosmology of the Norse and the Anglo-Saxons, just as there are differences between Coptic Christians and Southern Baptists. However, it is safe to assume that they share many core values and stories. Is Beowulf a Christian or a Germanic pagan story? Perhaps at first glance, this isn't even a question. After all, Grendel is a son of Cain. Doesn't that make it a Christian story? But if you look closer at many themes, you may notice many differences between Beowulf and biblical verse. Some of the strongest Christian imagery comes from Beowulf's fight with Grendel. In section 7, Beowulf tells Hrothgar that Grendel doesn't use any weapons, and thus the two must only fight with their bare hands. He goes on to say, "The foe I must grapple, fight for my life then, foeman with foeman. He fain must rely on the doom of the Lord, whom death layeth hold of." In other words, by only using his hands, Beowulf and Grendel would both rely not on their strength, but on a higher power, the power of each of their gods. A common biblical theme is of heroes ditching physical strength and relying upon heavenly power. Young King David, in the book of Samuel, forgoes using crafted sling bullets and chooses several stones from a stream. Similarly, when Gideon was at war with the Midianites, he weakened his own armies by only sending the fraction of his soldiers that drank from the stream like a dog to battle, and even with these small numbers, their God delivered them. As Beowulf and Grendel are locked in combat, Beowulf tears off Grendel's arm, reaffirming that Beowulf's arms, strengthened by his God, are stronger than Grendel, strengthened by the arm of his false god. This battle scene is reminiscent of a biblical story, when Moses and Pharaoh's priests turn their staffs to snakes, and Moses' staff eats Pharaoh's priest's staffs. Additionally, in chapter 3, the story says that while Hrothgar's people prayed and made offerings in their shrines to their idols, they were actually praying to the devil, and so the devil would not free them. It later said that God, the all-wielding ruler, would free them if they came to know him. It's very clear that the true victor wasn't a man named Beowulf, but the true God. However, Beowulf's story doesn't just parallel the Christian God. This is especially apparent in Beowulf's final moments, in which a dormant dragon awakes and rains fire upon his kingdom. Beowulf, determined though aged, fights against the dragon. While he is victorious in slaying the monster, he is poisoned by it, and shortly thereafter loses his life. Similarly, the Germanic peoples believed in Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, a massive serpentine dragon whose long body wrapped around the entire earth. This dragon was dormant on the ocean floor, but it was prophesied that one day he would awake and rain fiery venom on the earth, and the god Thor would meet him in battle. While Thor would slay the dragon, he would be overtaken by the venom, and only take 9 more steps before falling to his death. Is it possible that Beowulf is an inflection of the god Thor? One of the clearest Christian influences in Beowulf is Cain. However, if you read Beowulf's description of Cain, it doesn't completely coincide with Cain from the Bible. While it does say Cain was banished for murdering the Lord's cherished son Abel, it also says that Cain was a progenitor of giants, elves, and other monstrous creatures. This is something that Cain is not attributed to doing in the Bible. It parallels something very closely in Germanic mythology. The Germanic peoples believed that the god Balder, who was a god of purity and light, was beloved by all the gods. Because Balder was so pure, all the materials on the earth had sworn to the gods that they wouldn't do him harm, that is except for one material, mistletoe. Mistletoe was too young at that time to swear that it wouldn't hurt the god Balder. Just like now, you can't legally make a contract if you're below the consenting age. Similarly, they believed that mistletoe was a material that was too young to make a binding contract. One day, the gods were playing a game, hurling sharp objects at Balder, which bounced off him without doing any harm. Loki went and crafted a spear of mistletoe, as it was the only object that hadn't sworn not to harm Balder. Loki brought this mistletoe spear to the blind god Hoder, and he urged him to throw it at Balder. Hoder unsuspectingly trusted in Loki, and he threw the spear, killing his brother. The gods, enraged with Loki, bound him with the entrails of his son, and dangled a venomous snake above him, while his wife Sigyn held a bowl over Loki, trying to catch the venom. When the bowl would overfill, venom would spill out, and Loki would writhe in agony, causing the earth to quake and tremble. So in short, it looks like there's two Cains. Cain is described in the Bible, and Cain is described in Beowulf. While Cain in the Bible and in Beowulf have some similarities, predominantly being that they both murdered their brother, there's actually more similarities between Cain and Beowulf and Loki, given the fact that Loki was also banned for murdering one of the gods who was like his brother and being exiled from their presence, he also being described as a giant and the progenitor of several monsters. Loki had 3 terrifying children that would destroy the earth, heaven, and slay many of the gods. These 3 children were Fenrir the wolf, whose name means the one of the fen or the swamp, Hel, the guardian of the dead, and Jormungandr the dragon. Each of these 3 children would play a huge part in the demise of the gods. Fenrir the wolf would devour Odin, Jormungandr would slay Thor, and the undead armies of Hel would kill many great heroes. Perhaps each of these monsters can be correlated to monsters in Beowulf. Grendel could correlate to Fenrir, Grendel's mother could correlate to Hel, and Jormungandr could correlate to the dragon. First we will examine the connections between Grendel and Fenrir. Both are described as being giant and swamp-living creatures. Fenrir's name literally means the one who lives in the fen or the swamp, and many references say that Grendel is the one of the fens or the marsh. They are both created by a murderous father who is banned from civilization by a supreme deity. However, they are both described differently in terms of physical appearance. Fenrir is clearly defined as a wolf, while Grendel's physical appearance is actually barely mentioned in the epic. From what little we do know, Grendel was described as being much larger than a man, and also in the wretched guise of man, meaning he was deformed or ugly, or merely vaguely in the shape of a human. However, Grendel is also described as having claws, so it is clear that he does have some beastly attributes. Maybe he was a furry. Grendel essentially is a more savage or wild man. While physically appearing much like people, his untamable violence and literal thirst for human blood makes him more like a beast. Grendel behaves like an animal, but looks like a human, much as wolves are to dogs, as Grendel is to humans. Both look similar, though they act much differently. One tame, domesticated and civilized, the other violent, uncontrollable, and chaotic. A swamp is also the sort of transition or hybrid. Just as Grendel is the hybrid between a man and a beast, a swamp is a hybrid of land and water. You could say a swamp is half chaotic and half tamed. Swamps were very important in Germanic mythology as well. Heorot is described as being close to swamps. The goddess Frigg, the mother of Balder, dwelt in the palace Fensalir, literally meaning fen halls or swamp castle. It was actually at Fensalir where Loki had deceitfully learned that mistletoe was Balder's only weakness. Thus it was at Fensalir, the beginning of the end for not only Balder, but actually the earth as well, as Balder's death sparked Ragnarok, the series of apocalyptic events that would bring civilization to its end. While it's unclear why Fenrir was given this name, it is possible that it was given to him in reference to Fensalir, possibly a way that Loki was bragging of his deceit. Grendel and the dragon are the most identifiable with Fenrir and Jormungandr, their 2 Germanic counterparts. While there are still similarities between Hel and Grendel's mother, chiefly being that they each have a relation with Cain and Loki, and that they are humanoid, and that they're associated with the other 2 beasts. However, it is a little harder to accurately pin a correlation between the 2, as little is spoken of the 2 of them. For instance, the main source of Germanic mythology never mentions if Hel is ever killed, as are her 2 brothers. Likewise, very little description is given to Grendel's mother, and she isn't mentioned until after Grendel is defeated. Regardless, we see that there are more similarities between the 2, though these are a little more contextual. Grendel's mother was described to be large, and it was implied that she was very ugly. Half of Hel's face was described as being blue, and considering the fact that she ruled over those who died from decay and sickness, her face was probably rotting off. So we're not talking about a beautiful sky blue, we're talking about a decaying, rotting blue. Imagine going on a date with a girl, and half of her face is rotting off. I don't know about you, but to me, that's not super attractive. I'm not really into zombies though. But hey, to each his own. Both Hel and Grendel's mother have antagonistic qualities. Hel's dead souls join with Loki to fight against Odin and the valiant soldiers in his palace. While Hel never can be attributed to directly fighting against the gods, as Grendel's mom is, she was certainly subverting Odin's control and providing the means for Loki's revenge. The last big tie between the two is that Hel rules over a kingdom of death, and Grendel's mother presides over a watery realm. Water and often deep oceans are a symbol of death, as sinking into the ocean is like being buried in a grave, and though we need water for life, one cannot live in water. Similarly, we need death for life. We must eat animals and plants. Without death, life cannot survive. But life cannot exist if it is fully immersed in death. Water is also fluid like blood, and its waves are chaotic, ever-changing and unconquerable, just as death comes when it's least expected. A great ocean storm may come randomly. In many mythologies, the dead must cross water to reach their destination. Water isn't just a symbol of death in the Germanic culture, but also it is commonly found in other cultures as well. In Greek mythology, the dead are ferried across a river. The Celts believed the other world was across the Western Sea. The Aztecs believed that before they could reach their underworld, Mictlan, that they would cross a river of blood. Baptism symbolizes death and resurrection. Some Germanic chieftains would be buried in their boats, or their corpses would be set sail and lit ablaze. Water and death are synonymous in many cultures and religions across the earth. Beowulf is riddled with Germanic themes. Beowulf himself is a masculine martial ruler, and while there are some combat exchanges in the Bible, battles tend to be a smaller piece of a bigger spiritual lesson. While Beowulf is only a warrior, he never made contact directly with God, as Moses had with the burning bush, or Samuel when he heard the voice of God. There were no angels or cherubs, or heavenly manifestations. The only supernatural beings were the triad of monsters which vexed the protagonist, and these monsters do have a lot of similarities with Loki's children. The extent of God's involvement with Beowulf was providing militaristic success, which is one of the main functions of the Germanic gods. Additionally, there is a large emphasis on paying back obligations, as Beowulf went to Heorot to kill Grendel to repay his father's debt to Hrothgar. This theme is especially present in Beowulf's final moments as he fights the dragon in his old age, in order to fulfill his duty as king, and in being fully faithful to his duty, Beowulf is killed. Oaths were a very important part of Germanic mythology and culture. While Beowulf does have some Christian themes, he also represents the ideal Germanic pagan man, brave, honest, and unconquerable. Beowulf's death was the ideal Germanic death. He lived to his old age, but he didn't die of it. Hel's kingdom, which also shares her name, was reserved for those who died of sickness and age. All of those in her kingdom would rise up against the gods in the world's final days, whereas the brave who died in battle were sent to the lowest tier of heaven, where they would live in luxurious halls of Odin, and later clash against the forces of chaos. Beowulf's death was the pinnacle of the story. It was his defining moment, and it was more Germanic than Mercedes-Benz. Beowulf's death further highlights Germanic beliefs as it reveals the story's cyclical format. The poem began with the burial of a great king. Beowulf then rises and becomes a mighty king himself, but later was challenged by a great beast. Beowulf, undaunted, wouldn't cower and abandon his people, likely knowing it would be his demise. Shortly thereafter, he was destroyed, and perhaps his kingdom as well. The story ends with Beowulf's burial. In other words, the story begins with the burial of a mighty king, and it ends with the burial of a mighty king. This cyclical format patterns after the Germanic understanding of the universe, in which they viewed time much like a great wheel, as the world began with the fierce giant Ymir, who ruled as king of chaos. Ymir was then slayed by Odin, who rose up and created the world, and ruled over it as king. And later, he and many of the gods, including Thor, went to battle against the triad of beasts, despite the fact that they knew that not only they would be destroyed, but also their kingdoms and civilization. In other words, this story began with the death of a king, and it ended with the death of a king as well. Another example of Beowulf's Germanic paganism is the usage of the word Middle-earth. The Germanic peoples believed the universe was crafted from the corpse of the giant Ymir and formed into a tree. 9 worlds stemmed from this tree, the center world being Earth, where humans reside. The name of our world was hence called Midgard, or Middle-earth. This name was also later used by J.R.R. Tolkien in his Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. We also see references to other Germanic heroes, such as the Volsungs or Volsungs. The Volsung saga is explicitly Germanic pagan, and centers around a line of heroic warrior kings descended from Odin. Waylon the Smith is also mentioned in passing. Wayland is mentioned in various texts throughout the Germanic diaspora, including in the Eddas, the main source of Germanic mythology. Finally, Beowulf is a poem. Oftentimes, poems were created as a way for bards to memorize long tales and preserve them orally throughout the ages. That may mean that Beowulf was actually a Germanic poem, passed orally way before it had first been written by the Anglo-Saxon monks. I find it very curious that this Anglo-Saxon poem makes almost no mention of Anglo-Saxons in England, but rather focuses on the Frese, the Geats, and the Danes. Perhaps this is because the poem was crafted before these peoples had colonized England. Similar to how many youth in the Americas sing nursery rhymes or tell stories centered in European places of origin. This could make sense, as in this time, the Germanic peoples were still not the dominant ethnic group in the British Isles, and were still relative newcomers compared to the Celts. Perhaps many of the Christian themes were added after Beowulf's story was created, in an attempt to make it more suitable to their current beliefs. Or perhaps it was a way of explaining Christianity in terms of a Germanic culture and religion. Maybe it was a pseudo-history meant to create a past connection with the newfound god, a way to sort of fit in with the Hebrews. It could be that Beowulf is the product of a world that was trying to make heads and tails of both the old gods and of Christianity. While we cannot clearly say why Beowulf was made, it is a window to the past, allowing us to take a peek at the twilight of a now faded culture. Perhaps it will never be clear which symbols were Germanic or of Hebrew origin. Perhaps because some symbols have a universal meaning, which transcend all nationalities and tongues. Though the Anglo-Saxon language is extinct, and the culture now gone, their stories have stuck with us throughout the ages. And though there are no dragons which lurk about, our problems which threaten us daily are like giant monsters, and as our friends abandon us, we alone must face our trials. I wonder if Beowulf is neither Christian nor Germanic, but altogether human.